أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها النبي اتق الله. يا أيها النبي اتق الله ولا تطع الكافرين والمنافقين. إن الله كان عليما حكيما. واتبع ما يوحى إليك من ربك. إن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. وتوكل على الله وكفى بالله وكيلا. ما جعل الله لرجل من قلبين في جوفه وما جعل أزواجكم اللائي تظاهرون منهن أمهاتكم وما جعل أدعياءكم أبناءكم ذلكم قولكم بأفواهكم والله يقول الحق وهو يهدي السبيل. ادعوهم لآبائهم هو أقسط عند الله. فإن لم تعلموا آباءهم فإخوانكم في الدين ومواليكم. وليس عليكم جناح فيما أخطأتم به ولكن ما تعمدت قلوبكم وكان الله غفورا رحيما. النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم وأزواجه أمهاتهم وأولو الأرحام بعضهم أولى ببعض في كتاب الله من المؤمنين والمهاجرين إلا أن تفعلوا إلى أوليائكم معروفا. كان ذلك في الكتاب مسطورا. وإذا أخذنا من النبيين ميثاقهم ومنك ومن نوح وإبراهيم وموسى وعيسى ابن مريم وأخذنا منهم ميثاقا غليظا. ليسأل الصادقين عن صدقهم وأعد للكافرين عذابا أليما. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Faisal. At this time, I'd like to begin the program by requesting Brother Ali for recitation with the loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
سوات. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. حسین دل ہے، حسین جان ہے، حسین دل ہے، حسین جان ہے. حسین قرآن کی زبان ہے، حسین سجدوں کی سرزبی ہے، حسین چہروں کا آسبا ہے، حسین چہروں کا آسبا ہے. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. حسین زخموں بڑی کہانی، حسین زخموں بڑی کہانی. حسین عظمت کا آستہ ہے، اٹھارا ہے جو لاش اکبر. حسین پورا نہیں جمع ہے، حسین پورا نہیں جمع ہے. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. حسین ایمان کی جستجو، حسین زخموں بڑی کہانی، حسین زخموں بڑی کہانی. حسین عظمت کا آستہ ہے، اٹھارا ہے جو لاش اکبر. حسین بھولا نہیں جمع ہے، حسین بھولا نہیں جمع ہے. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. حسین ایمان کی جستجو ہے، حسین ایمان کی جستجو ہے. حسین یزنا کی آبرو ہے. حسین تنہا تھا کربلا میں، حسین کا ذکر چار سو ہے، حسین کا ذکر چار سو ہے. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے، نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. حسین دل ہے، حسین جان ہے، حسین دل ہے، حسین جان ہے. نہ پوچھ میرا حسین کیا ہے. سوات.
Jazakallah, Brother Ali. One more loud salawat for him, please. At this time, I'd like to request Brother Salman for recitation of poetry with the loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
عین سے عین عبادت کا سرانجام ہوا، عین سے عین عبادت کا سرانجام ہوا، لام وہ لام کے جس لام سے اسلام ہوا، لام وہ لام کے جس لام سے اسلام ہوا، یہ سے یاور ہوئے مشکل میں ہر ایک بندے کی، یہ سے یاور ہوئے مشکل میں ہر ایک بندے کی، صدقے اس نام پہ کیا خوب علی نام ہوا، صدقے اس نام پہ کیا خوب علی نام ہوا، عین سے عین، صلوات پڑھ دیجیے، اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد، اور ایک باعث بلند صلوات۔ سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، قدم قدم پہ قدم قدم پہ رلایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، وہ اپنا حال یتیمی سنانے آئی تھی، وہ اپنا حال یتیمی سنانے آئی تھی، پدر کی لاش سے پتھر ہٹانے آئی تھی، لگا کے درے ہٹایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، طلب کیا کسی ظالم نے جب کنیزی میں طلب کیا کسی ظالم نے، جب کنیزی میں چھپا لیا اسے زینب نے اپنی گودی میں، نہ پوچھو کیسے، نہ پوچھو کیسے بچایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، وہ پشت ناقہ پہ تنہا، وہ تیز رفتاری، وہ پشت ناقہ پہ تنہا، وہ تیز رفتاری، سنبھلتی کیسے سفر میں حسین کی پیاری، گری نہیں ہے، گری نہیں ہے، گرایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، سر حسین کو تکتے تھے عابد مضطر، سر حسین کو تکتے تھے عابد مضطر، تڑپنے لگتی تھی غازی کی لاش دریا پر، تماچا جب بھی، تماچا جب بھی لگایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، حجاب غیب کا مالک وہ درد رکھتا ہے، حجاب غیب کا مالک وہ درد رکھتا ہے، اٹھائے مشک تکلم تلاش کرتا ہے، کہاں پہ پانی، کہاں پہ پانی پلایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، قدم قدم پہ، قدم قدم پہ رلایا گیا سکینہ کو، سمجھ کے زہرا ستایا گیا سکینہ کو، بآواز بلند سلوات۔
Jazakallah khair, Brother Salman. One more loud salawat for him, please. Sisters, if anybody needs to be evaluated after that partition fell, please let us know. Dr. Hasan Abaskanani is here. Before I invite our guest scholar, just a few announcements. First and foremost, Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Jazakallah khair to Sayyid Suleiman Hassan Ali for accepting our invitation. As you can see, you coming out not only brings the community, but also scholars to come and attend your lectures as well. So we look forward eagerly to, thank you. We look forward to your lectures, and we learn and to learn from them and elevate ourselves as best as we can, inshallah. Before I request the Sayyid to send the members, just a few reminders. Each weekend, CFK will be hosting inviting guest speakers for each weekend program. Inshallah, next weekend we are honored to host Sheikh Ahmed Modaresi next weekend. The programs on Saturday and Sunday are set to begin with recitation of the Holy Quran at 7:15, ending with Matam, Salat al-Maghribain, and Niyaz to go. Jazakallah khair to all those who have donated in these days to the City of Knowledge. Alhamdulillah, we are almost to our goal for this year. Please remember, we don't do any active fundraising in between programs. It is requested to all those who can, please help us reach our goal and donate as much as you can. There are sponsorship slots available online and updated every day at cfkdfw.org. A reminder to our mothers, we would like to remind you that we do have a room set up for young children to utilize for their ease and to minimize disturbances in the main hall during the program. As always, event details are posted on our WhatsApp group as well as our webpage. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, find the QR code to join our WhatsApp group, and to donate and sponsor in these holy nights. For opportunities to help behind the scenes, or if you have any questions, please speak to myself or any of the volunteers. Before I request Sayyid to begin his speech, I would like to request a Surah Fatiha for the marhumin of tonight's program sponsors. Let us also include our own marhumin and mu'minat as well as those of the Muslim Ummah. At this time, I'd like to request Sayyid Suleiman to ascend the member for his speech tonight and ask that the brothers and sisters move as close to the member as you can with the loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
سورة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين، شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين، سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الهداة المهديين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي، أما بعد. فقد قال الله عز وجل في القرآن المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected Sheikh, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an honor to be in your company during these nights in the month of Muharram, when we honor and we mourn the martyrdom of Imam Hasan and the martyrs of Karbala. It would have been a privilege for me to benefit, inshallah, from the wisdom of Samahatul Sheikh, but I will say a few words, inshallah, and pray that Allah will accept from all of us this worship, this remembrance, and this gathering of grieving and of honoring the greatest of role models and the greatest of sacrifices that we have in human history. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The topic that I have chosen for my talks in this month of Muharram, and that I will briefly examine in the few nights that we are together, is the topic of living a God-centered life. And that, of course, is our goal as a believer, as a Muslim, to orient our life not to our whim or our habit or the temptations of this world, but towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet we find that because we live in a culture and in a society that is individualistic and is secular, and in many ways pushes us and teaches us to do the opposite of what is a God-centered life, even if we theoretically believe in the importance of orienting our life towards God, it might not be so easy for us to actually do it in practice, or even to know what it is that we need to change about our thinking, about our decision making, about our lives in order for us to fulfill that ideal in practice. And so that's why I want to examine the importance of a God-centered life and think about some of the things that we can do in order to be able to implement it and put it into practice. In spite of the difficulties that we have in our individualistic and our secular society. One encapsulation of the God-centered life is found in a message that our Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi Allahumma salli ala Muhammad was commanded by Allah to give to humanity. And this is perhaps a motto or a slogan that our Prophet taught us and that we can adopt. And so we should repeat it verbally as often as possible in our lives. And through that verbal repetition, strive for it to enter into our heart and our being, so that when we have to make a decision, when we are in a position of worry or stress, then this is the motto, this is the philosophy of life that comes to our mind and that informs our decision making. And that is found in Surah Al-An'am, where our Prophet is told, قُل, say, O Messenger, إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. My prayer and my worship, my life and my death are for Allah, the Lord of the worlds. La sharika lah. There is no associate or companion for Allah. وَبِذَلِكَ أُمِرْتُ. This is what I have been commanded to do. وَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And I am the first of those who submit. And this is a very important motto, not just in the context and in the time in which Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi Allahumma salli ala lived, but even for our time. It gives us a few reminders. قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي. Religion, first of all, is not a compartment of our life. Sometimes people say that Islam is a way of life, and that is better than to think of it as just a doctrine or a religious belief, but it is more than even a way of life. It is an encapsulation of reality. And Islam is not the adoption of a label or an identity, but rather it is literally submission to reality. Any part of reality that I rebel against goes against the nature of Islam and the spirit of Iman. That is the teaching of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, which we will examine inshallah a little more tomorrow. But the spirit of Islam is to submit and to accept anything that our heart, our mind, our conscience tells us is true. And so it is not just a belief system. It is not just a series of practices or obligations or rituals. It is not even a comprehensive way of life, but rather it is an orientation towards the truth and a submission to what is true, what is right, what is real. Many times we compartmentalize our faith. So we have times when we think about religion, and maybe we're even a little bit careful about our decision making. Muharram is one of those times. The month of Ramadan is one of those times. But sometimes there is actually a difficulty that we get because of our religiosity. So some of you have heard of the concept of buying indulgences. Now that was a theological practice in some schools of thought within Christianity. But it is also a psychological mistake that many people make. So if I have a diet, then I might be very strict about my diet for a number of days. And because of that very strictness and the observance of my diet, I might think that I have the license to cheat when a few days have passed. And sometimes the way that I cheat is worse than if I hadn't been observing that diet before. And the reason is I kind of feel like I've suffered or I've disciplined myself. And so now I'm not just going to have maybe that one piece of cake that I would have had. I am going to binge and eat the entire cake. Students often will experience this when you pull an all-nighter to study for an exam, then what is the day after the exam like? Are you back to a healthy study regime? Or is your book and your class the last thing that you want to think about? And sometimes it's not just that one day you need to recuperate because you pulled an all-nighter, so nobody should begrudge you if you sleep 10 or 11 hours after not having slept at all. But then how long does that transition period last? Sometimes it's until classes start again, which might be 2 weeks later or it might be a month later. And that is not healthy. It's not healthy for our diet. It is not healthy for our educational and intellectual advancement. And it is not healthy for our religion. So if I practice with great discipline and care in the month of Muharram, or in the month of Ramadan, or if I go for ziyarat, or if I engage in ibadah in Laylatul Qadr. But then I think that now I have saved up some divine satisfaction, and so I have an excuse to kind of slack off for a few days or a few weeks, or in the case of Muslims' religious practice, sometimes even for a few months. For some people, it is Ashura to Ashura. So after the month of Ramadan is over, no more fasting, no more Quran, no more extra ibadah, until the next month of Ramadan comes. After Muharram is over, then no more special attention to our spirituality and to the model of Ahlul Bayt until the next year comes. Then in reality, we are not affirming our religious identity in those moments, but rather we are undermining it, because during our periods of religious practice and discipline, we are not serving Allah with humility, but we are building capital and an excuse for us to slack off afterwards. And then afterwards, of course, even if we have a little capital that we have built, we are spending it and we are wasting it. So it is very instructive that this motto taught to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it singles out our worship. And not just one form of worship, but salat and nusuk. And nusuk also means worship. Sometimes it is used in particular for the rites of Hajj, and in a more general sense, it is all of the ritual and all of the worship that you do for Allah. Now, you don't need to single out worship when you say your life and your death are for Allah. But it is something that bears emphasis and reminding for two reasons. The first reason is that in some cases, our religion is not for God, it is for ourselves. And so we have to remember that inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen la sharika lah. So the first reason is that my prayer is not to make me feel like I am somebody, but rather to be an act of turning towards God and being grateful and being humble before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In some cases, our worship is not really oriented towards Allah. And the second reason is that salat is meant to be the most important and the central priority of our religious life. And religious life means the entirety of our thinking and acting, planning and doing. So religion is centered around, and the pillar of our faith is our salat. So let's just examine briefly these two reasons why it is important to remind ourselves that our prayer is for Allah. Otherwise, superficially, that doesn't really bear saying. Who else are you going to pray for? No Muslim puts an idol in front of them or their bank statement or their brokerage account statement and says that I'm going to pray to this money or I am going to pray to this food. Of course, we pray to Allah, but without realizing it, sometimes it isn't truly for Allah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So the first part, that we want to make sure that our prayer is truly for Allah. How many times have we felt this, heard this, or experienced this? Where we want to worship Allah and we feel that our community, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We feel that our community is an obstacle in our worship. I've heard from some people that on Laylatul Qadr, for example, they want to get through a certain number of du'as or a certain amount of worship. And they say that I would rather do it at home than come to a community center and engage in that worship with my community. Why? Because when you come with the community, then first of all, there are kids who are sometimes running around and can serve as a distraction. And sometimes the reciter might stumble because they have not practiced or they are not as experienced as you might like. And sometimes because there are breaks and there are other pauses, you have to settle for a smaller amount of worship than you would like. And sometime, horror of horrors, a volunteer might come to you and say that we are short-staffed, so can you help set up the food or clean up the center? And I have seen people, and many of us may have experienced this, where somebody becomes a little bit upset that, I came to worship Allah. Why are you distracting me with something that will prevent me from doing dua? Now, there is a time for us to worship individually. And certainly that is not something that we should ignore. In fact, when I look at my own religious practice, because we often are with a community, I can say that for myself, and some of you also may be able to relate, that we do more as a community than we do as an individual. I'm not speaking for you, I'm speaking of myself, and that is not good. That is something to work on. But then you look at many of the du'as that we have from Ahlul Bayt for these special nights. And you will find that, for example, the dua of Arafah of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Sallu ala Muhammad, was a dua that the Imam recited in a group of companions. Many of the du'as that we have been taught by Imam Zainul Abidin and by our other Imams, they use the plural form. We don't have to go far if you look at Surah Al-Fatiha. Now, most of us, we perform the majority of our prayers individually. But that was not the original intention of Salat. It was meant to create a community, it was meant to create an ummah, it was meant to bring people together. And if you look at the prayer that we have in Surah Al-Fatiha after dhikr of Allah, it's not إِيَّاكَ أَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ أَسْتَعِينُ اهْدِنِ الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمُ. When I say it, it sounds odd to you. But that is often what many of us are thinking. or that is often what many of us are practicing. We don't say, "Oh Allah, you alone I worship, you alone I seek help from. Guide me to the straight path." But all of us are familiar with Surah Al-Fatiha, and the same thing is the philosophy that we find running through the du'as and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Oh Allah, we only worship you. Oh Allah, we only seek help from you. Oh Allah, guide us to the straight path. And then that path is also defined as the path of a group of people. So we are praying as a collective, and we are praying as a collective to be united with a collective. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. All three of them are groups. The group that you have blessed, O Allah, we want to be with them. And we want to be protected from two groups: the groups that are worthy of God's wrath and the group that is astray. Maybe they may not be at fault because they are not straying deliberately. It is out of ignorance. It is out of the weakness of the soul. But that is another group. And even if they are not at fault, we don't want to be part of that deviation. Sometimes people say that, what about all these non-Muslims? Many of them are good people. Yeah, many of them are good people. And we don't judge their goodness in terms of their intentions or their soul, nor do we determine whether they are going to heaven or hell. That's above our pay grade. God knows who is worthy of hell and who is worthy of heaven. When we pray to Allah, all we are saying is that alcohol is evil. And if Allah has guided me to know that alcohol is evil, then I want to be protected from those people who deliberately sell and tempt people to become intoxicated and harm themselves and break up their family and destroy society. But I also want to be protected from those people who may not be at fault. They grew up in a society that drinks. They never understood the extent of its damage. So I'm not sending them to hell, and I am not able to determine where they deserve to go and where they don't deserve to go. That's above my pay grade. But I don't want to be part of that society when they get drunk and they throw up on the person sitting next to them, or when they drive and they cause damage to people's health or maybe even take their life. Regardless of how much at fault they are or how much at fault they are not, I want to be separate from al-maghdub alayhim and al-dhalleen. But the point is that that is a prayer for the collective. And so in my religiosity, once again, I'm not saying that you have to always come on Yom Arafah or on Laylatul Qadr or on any night of ibadah as a community. Because there are many factors that determine what is the best decision for yourself or for your family at a given time. But if the reason why you don't want to come to your community is because being in a collective is an inconvenience, that is the wrong factor and a wrong reason to say I'd rather do it alone. My point is that sometimes our very religious practice, we think that we are doing it for Allah. We think that we want to be pious and we want to be religious. But what we think of as religious is exactly something that takes us away from humility and away from obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Or another very common experience is, I really want to be religious, but my parents are standing in my way. I want to go and study in the seminary, but my parents are putting conditions or they are not happy with that decision. Now, it is a challenge to deal with our family relationships and our obligations to our family. Sometimes parents make it easy. And there is a hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. رحم الله والدين أعانا ولدهما على برهما. Narrated in various forms but with a similar meaning. Allah has mercy on those parents who make it easy for their children to be good to them. Sometimes those of you who are ulama here and scholars, you've probably had this experience, and those of you who are parents, you might have been on the other side of the transaction. Maulana, please talk about the importance of honoring your parents. Kids today, they don't honor their parents. There's both sides of the transaction that I'm sure we've experienced here. But how easy have we made it for our children to honor us? If I don't spend time with them, if I don't inform them of their heritage and their history and the history of their family and what expectations Islam has and our cultures have of children, if I don't show them with my own humility before my parents, whether they be alive or they be deceased, whether they be with me or whether they be in a different city or a different country, if I don't listen to my children and hear them out, if I don't appreciate that they are often raised with many pressures and many stresses that I did not have in my time. And I'm not speaking of immigrants, saying that, well, when you immigrate to this society, you have many different circumstances and many different pressures that didn't exist in Pakistan or in India or in Afghanistan or in Iraq. I'm speaking even myself, I was born and raised in this society. I went to school in a public school in the United States. But when I look at my own children, they have so many pressures and so many struggles that I cannot relate to. Because I'm very old. Time before internet and phones. And, even in my time, if people wanted to sin, then you had to have a little bit of a negative form of courage. You had to go looking for it. But today, that temptation and that sin, it comes towards you. So if I don't appreciate the cultural gap, if there is a cultural gap between two different countries or two different civilizations, if I don't appreciate the change in technology and the change of culture within one society, if I don't show humility to my children and I don't model humility and openness, then I can go to a million Maulanas, and we have several ulama here who are more learned and more eloquent than I am, and they can probably do a better job of informing people of the teachings of Islam about the obligations of children to parents. But if you don't do i'anat, if you don't help your children, then it is not going to have the desired effect, if it will have any effect at all. So it is certainly true that as parents, we have an obligation to make it easy for our children to be good, to do bir, to do ihsan, to show goodness to their parents. That is a far more important task than for me to preach to them, or these days many mothers, they just forward WhatsApp messages and clips to their sons and daughters that, well, look what this person said and look what this person did, and hope that that will somehow have an effect. That's not how you're going to convince your children to be good to their parents. You have to help them. And you help them by modeling. You help them by being humble in your own relationships. You help them by hearing and communicating and listening. But having said that, now as a child, if my parent does not make it easy for me, then I still have an obligation. And I cannot say that because they are not perfect, then I can turn my back on my obligation. Sometimes you do have to nicely say to your parents that I cannot obey a particular command, particularly if they tell you to do something that is haram, if they tell you to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you still have to do ihsan, you still have to show kindness. And once again, I am not saying that you will always need to obey, because that depends on the nature of the issue and what and how and why your parents are asking you to do something. According to the fatwa of our fuqaha, if your parents tell you to do something out of a concern for your well-being and for your safety, then it is an obligation for you to follow it. And if they tell you to do something, for example, because they always dreamed that their child would follow a certain career, but it's not because of a concern for your safety or for your well-being, then it isn't an obligation, but it is still one way you can honor your parents by fulfilling their dreams even before you fulfill your own dreams. It's not an obligation, though. If, however, I think of my parents as an obstacle to my religiosity, then I'm doing it wrong. I'm thinking it wrong. I am framing it in an unhealthy way. So once again, that doesn't mean that you should obey or you shouldn't obey. That is a separate question which has its own complexity. But what many people make the mistake of doing is they think that, you know what, I'm going to block out my parents a little bit. I'm going to tune out my parents a little bit. I am going to put some distance between myself and my parents because they are an obstacle for my religiosity. And this is another example where I want to be religious, but in reality, the way that I'm thinking and conceiving of religion is actually taking me away from God. Because what do people substitute? When they want to put themselves away from parents, they tune out their parents and say this is an obstacle, or it could be my family members. My siblings are not that religious, and so I'm not going to give them a lot of importance. There are many families where Allah has blessed one member, maybe one sibling, maybe one cousin, maybe one member of an extended group to be religious. But what happens is that their religiosity often alienates and turns the rest of the family off towards religion because of how insular and how harsh their words or their character is. By definition, your family is not an obstacle. Why? Because your family was chosen for you by God. And God does not give you obstacles to your religiosity, He gives you tests. Tests are not something that you want to flee from. They are something that you want to learn how to succeed in. And so if you have family members who are irreligious, or maybe not up to what you consider to be your level or your standard, then the solution is not to tune them out. But the solution is to see how is it possible for you to soften their heart a little bit. How is it possible for you to honor that relationship that was given to you by God? And to preserve your own faith and your own family, and if you have children, how to preserve their faith in spite of an environment or relatives that may not share all of the same values or all of the same practice. But see how the framing is different? I'm not going to say that this is an obstacle. I'm going to say that this is a test. And the way I succeed in the test is by honoring the relationship. That doesn't mean that you have to be very close. Sometimes it is more closeness. Sometimes it is by putting certain forms of distance or certain kinds of protection between yourself and a bad influence while still maintaining a connection and honoring a relationship. There's a very beautiful incident from the life of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, that illustrates this point. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq had a relative, a cousin, known as Hasan al-Aftas. Now, a relative, and a cousin is a close relative, especially in the tribal society of the time of the Imams. Today we kind of barely have as much of a relationship with our siblings and our nuclear family as people used to have and should have with their extended family. But this person had maybe jealousy, maybe animosity towards the Imams. And in the political commotion of the Abbasid revolution, their loyalties were with the Abbasids, and they took a position for the Abbasids, and because of that position, this person, Al-Aftas, attacked and attempted to assassinate Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Now, whatever disagreements you may have with your family, you were moving, they promised to come, and they canceled last minute, and you had to suffer. They borrowed your car, and they dinged it a little bit and never even offered compensation. They made a little bit of a scene, or they were passive aggressive at a graduation, or these are the types of issues that most of us are dealing with. Certainly, we're not dealing with people who attempted to assassinate us, for the most part. And yet, look at our sixth Imam. This is a role model. A person attempted to kill not just a relative, but a ma'soom Imam. Now, if somebody was passive aggressive with me, then I might be very angry at them, but at least I have to admit that if they are 80% at fault, probably at least 20%, I was at fault as well. If they were upset with me and if they acted in a somewhat unkind manner, maybe they were majority at fault, but there was probably something that I did or I didn't do or I could have done better. But with the Imam, of course, there was nothing that the Imam was negligent in or did not do. So what did our sixth Imam do? When he was on his deathbed, he made a will and he said, give 70 dinars to Hasan al-Aftas. Now, not looking at purchasing power, but just the value of gold. That's something probably in the neighborhood of $15,000. That's a significant amount of money to give to somebody that tried to kill you and never reconciled and never apologized. It's one thing if they came and they made up and compensated you. It's another thing if they are still unapologetic. Now, one of the family members of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, sallu ala Muhammad, comes to the Imam and says, are you going to give this much money to somebody who tried to kill you? And the Imam said that in Surah Al-Ra'd, Allah says, وَالَّذِينَ يَصِلُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلْ. The believers are those, or ulul albab are those who bring connections and restore connections that Allah has commanded us to honor. He didn't say that this person is now beyond the pale. But notice that the Imam waited until he was on his deathbed. It wasn't that the Imam was delaying that kindness. It was that this was the only time where the Imam had an avenue, because if he had given something before, when somebody is filled with hatred or jealousy, then they will always take it in a negative light. Sometimes we have relationships like that. You call somebody up to ask how they're doing. Oh, you remembered me. What do you want now? Now, if they are going to be negative, then even my kindness is not going to bring a restoration of the relationship. So it wasn't that Imam Ja'far Sadiq waited years and said that I don't want to have to do with anything with this person, but rather because of the nature of the animosity of the other person, the Imam's only opportunity to try to bring some kind of healing to a relationship and maybe end the animosity, or maybe at least ensure that it would not be passed on to the next generation, is to show kindness on the deathbed. If there was receptivity on the other side, the Imam would have done it sooner. It wasn't that the Imam was delaying. So we see here the philosophy that we have from Ahlul Bayt. The point is, never think of a relationship given to you by Allah as an obstacle to your religiosity. At most, it is a trial and a test. And you succeed in that test by seeing how you can honor it. In this case, in Imam Ja'far Sadiq's life, he may not have had any contact with that relative for years. Not because he did not wish it, but because the other person was not willing and not receptive. But there was still within the heart of our Imam the desire to maintain and to restore that relationship. And the greater tragedy in our time is when people say that these relationships given to me by Allah are an obstacle to my religiosity, so I will choose friends and community to substitute. Now, once again, you do want to surround yourselves with an environment of people who are faithful, because they will reinforce and they will strengthen your own faith. And if you have childhood friends, or if you have close relatives who are not religious, then you don't want to have such a close relationship with them that rubs off on you or rubs off on your family members. That's not the point. But it shouldn't be, this is an obstacle, and so my real family is my friends. Because what did my family ever do for me? That would be like, for example, a novice investor. Right? I just found out what the stock market is. Being offered by, say, one of the greatest investors in history, say Warren Buffett, or whoever else there is. He says that, look, you have this money to invest. Do you want me to choose where to invest it? Or do you want to choose yourself? And you're like, no, I just got a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to choose myself. You're a fool. And if a person with infinite knowledge tells you that I will choose for you or you can choose for yourself, how much more of a fool do I need to be to say that I will substitute my own picking for what Allah has chosen in His wisdom? So the first reason that we need to affirm that even our worship is for Allah is because it's not as obvious as it seems. Sometimes I think my salat is for Allah, but in reality, it is for myself. And when I'm angry at Allah, I lose my motivation to pray. When I'm not in that good company, I lose my motivation. And if He doesn't answer my prayer, then I get disappointed. But you come towards those who are chosen by Allah, and when they are surrounded by enemy soldiers, then they say that this is the time when I want to have an opportunity to pray. On the eve of the 10th of Muharram, the night of Ashura, as the thousands of gathered soldiers of Umar ibn Sa'ad were preparing for battle, and the sounds of them putting the hooves on their horses and sharpening their swords and weapons and preparing for battle would definitely be heard by the camp and by the family and by the companions of Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein said to his brother Abbas that, "Oh my brother, go to the enemy and say that let us have one more night before we do battle, because God is my witness. I love to pray and I love to recite Quran." if your life is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then in that moment you won't say Allah has abandoned me and so I will abandon Allah. You will say Allah has tested me, Allah has honored me, Allah has chosen a path for me, and so I will be grateful to Allah and I will worship Allah. And it is said that that night of Ashura was spent in worship and recitation of Quran. And the companions of the Imam were happy and were light-hearted because Allah had honored them with martyrdom. And they were ready to die. Let us think about how that night might have passed. In addition to worship, there was preparation. It is sometimes said that Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas brought together the young members of Banu Hashim in all their beauty and all their courage. Aun and Muhammad, Ali Akbar and Qasim, his own three brothers, the sons of al-Baneen, and the young warriors of Banu Hashim. And maybe Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas would have told them the stories of sacrifice and courage of his father Amir al-Mu'mineen and his uncle Ja'far al-Tayyar and the martyrs of Islam like Hamza, Sayyid al-Shuhada of his time. And perhaps Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas would have said that maybe you thought it was a sport or a game. But when I trained you in how to hold a sword and how to do battle, then in my eyes, it was for this battle that we are going to fight tomorrow. Oh, the young members of my family, when the day of Ashura comes, then do not let Abbas be embarrassed that he did not train you well. Some of you are too young even to have armor that will fit you, but you are the sons of Ali alayhi salam. You are the family of the Prophet. When the call for battle comes, go forth first to your Imam and offer your lives. And if that encouragement was given by Abbas, then how many times did he himself go to Imam Hussein and say that, oh my master, oh my commander, I am at your command, I am ready to go and defend Islam. The final time was when the evening had drawn near and the day of Ashura was coming towards its culmination. And 72 bodies lie on the sands of Karbala. And Imam Hussein's body and Abbas's body are both covered with wounds. Because together these two brothers had gone to the battlefield every time to bring a body of a wounded or a martyred warrior back towards the camp. Now these two brothers who were inseparable from the morning of Ashura until the afternoon are going to be separated. Abbas comes to the Imam and says that, oh my master, do I have permission to go to the battlefield? And Imam Hussein broke down in tears. He said that you are the standard bearer of my army. Oh Abbas, you are my right-hand person. If you go to the battlefield, then what will be left of my army? And Abbas looked towards the tents. He looked towards the battlefield. And then he looked towards where the bodies of the martyrs lay on the ground. He said that, oh my master, where is this army that I am the standard bearer of? I have prepared. I have waited for this day. I promised our father on his deathbed that I would give my life to defend your honor. Oh, my master, give me permission. For if Imam Ali could single-handedly save the day in Badr and Uhud, then I hope that I can single-handedly defeat this army that has come against you, and perhaps Allah will save your life. And the Imam said that, O Abbas, put your sword in its sheath. There is another battle that you will fight. This most courageous warrior will fight a battle with no weapon. He took a water skin and he took the standard of the Imam. And as he heard the cries of the children calling out, Al-Atash, Al-Atash, thirst, he went towards the water and he filled that water skin. The enemy soldiers fled before him. But when he turned back and they saw that now Abbas was undefended and his only concern was to bring water to quench the thirst of Sakina and Ali al-Asghar, they attacked him all at once. There were 500 soldiers appointed to guard the Euphrates. And many more joined this attack on Abbas. I don't know how many hundreds of wounds there were on his body, but it was as if Abbas did not feel any of those blows and did not feel the blood that was gushing from his wounds. Even when his right arm was cut off, he only took the water skin and the standard in his left arm and continued on his way. When his left arm was cut off, he still managed to hold that water skin and that standard. It fluttered, but it did not fall. Abbas continued forward, but there was one arrow that struck the water skin and caused not his blood but the water to gush forth. And it was as if Abbas had now reached the end of his strength. As he fell from his mount, he called out, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. My final greetings, O my master, O my Imam. The Imam rushed to the side of Abbas. He cradled his head in his own lap. And then Imam Hussein said three things. Now, it is as if my back is broken and I have nowhere to turn, and my enemy is celebrating my tragedy. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا وَأَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. O Allah, accept this worship on our behalf and grant us to live a life that is oriented towards your obedience and your pleasure, so that we are worthy of the teachings and the guidance of Ahlul Bayt, and that we are honored with their company in this life and in the hereafter. Atami Hussein, Ya Hussein.
सजाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाज़ार जफ़ा। सजाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाज़ार जफ़ा। सजाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे मजमा है कूफियों का, मेरे चलने की जा कोई नहीं, बाज़ार जफ़ा। सजाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, सजाद मेरे सर से आदान छिनी चादर, बलवे में नबी ज़ादी फिर वाई गई दर दर। مل جائے ردا مجھ کو اور میری دعا کوئی نہیں. ہاں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. سجاد چلوں کیسے لاکھوں ہے تماشائی. یاد آتا ہے رہ رہ کے عباس میرا بھائی. فریاد کروں کس سے اب تیرے سوا کوئی نہیں. ہاں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. معلوم ہے ادا کو غازی کی بہن ہوں میں. بے دست ہے وہ غازی پابند رسن ہوں میں. یاد آئی وفا اس کی جب پاس رہا کوئی نہیں. ہاں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. سجاد میرے دل کو یہ درد ستاتا ہے. سر غازی کا نیزے سے جب خاک پہ آتا ہے. سر میرا کھلا دیکھے غم اس سے بڑا کوئی نہیں. ہاں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں. کوئی نہیں بازار جفا سجاد.
یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین.
شام
آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام. تیری امت کے زیور پہن کے تیری امت کے زیور پہن کے دیکھو نانا چلی ہوں میں شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام. تیری امت کے زیور پہن کے تیری امت کے زیور پہن کے دیکھو نانا چلی ہوں میں شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام. میں دیتی کفن تجھ کو بھیا گر سر پہ رضا میرے ہوتی. گر ہوتے کھلے ہاتھ میرے تیرے زخموں کو ہاتھوں سے دھوتی. پابندیرا سنسر پر رہنا پابندیرا سنسر پر رہنا. دیکھو بھیا چلی ہوں میں شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام شام آئے شام. میں نانا میں کیسے سناؤں دربار شفیع کا وہ منظر. سب والی و حافظ تھے بیٹھے اور سر پہ میری ناتی چادر. اے نانا تیری بیٹیوں کو اے نانا تیری بیٹیوں کو क्यों लाए हैं सर नंगे हम शाम हाय शाम 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 तेरे आबिद पे तारीख अशी थी और कुलसूम सहमी खड़ी थी कभी देखूं मैं जख्मी सकीना जिसके दामन में आग लगी थी कभी रोऊं मैं अपनी रिदा को कभी रोऊं मैं अपनी रिदा को कभी देखूं मैं जलते ख़याम शाम हाय शाम 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 तेरे बच्चों को लेकर गई मैं शब भर सारी रोती रही हूँ कभी गाजी का लहजा बदल के मैं पहरे भी देती रही हूँ इन बेवा बहू बेटियों से इन बेवा बहू बेटियों से क्यों करते नहीं हो कलाम शाम हाय शाम शाम हाय शाम शाम हाय शाम शाम हाय शाम अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि सलावत
أعوذ أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله وأن عليًا ولي الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أشهد أن محمد رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر أستغفر الله الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر أستغفر الله الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الله أكبر أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر، الله أكبر، الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله. تسبيح فاطمة الزهراء السلام الله عليها.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك والنجاة من النار ومن كل بلية والفوز بالجنة والرضوان في دار السلام وجوار نبيك محمد عليه وآله السلام. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك، لا إله إلا أنت، أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. اللهم صل على محمد.
سبحان ربي.